I write these words in December 1985, my hands shaking not from age, but from memories I've carried for 33 years. The doctors say the cancer will take me within months, and I refuse to die with this burden. What happened in our Kansas farmhouse in 1952 must be told not for forgiveness, but because silence protects evil, and I will not protect Thomas Morrison's memory any longer. My name is Eleanor Morrison. I was 17 when I discovered my brother had been attacking our mother for months, slowly killing her with his violence. I was 18 when I pushed him down the stairs and watched him die. This isn't a story about heroes or justice. It's about survival, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when love turns poisonous and family becomes the source of terror. Our farmhouse sat on 240 acres of stubborn Kansas soil, 5 miles from our nearest neighbor, 20 from the town of Willow Creek. The isolation that once felt like freedom became our prison when the men in my family revealed their true nature. Built in 1903 by my grandfather, the 2-story wooden house had thin walls that carried every sound, narrow hallways that trapped you with nowhere to run, and a basement where screams echoed but never reached the outside world. My father, Robert Morrison, returned from the Pacific War in 1946 as a stranger wearing my father's face. The gentle man who had taught me to milk cows and read bedtime stories died somewhere in the jungles of Guadalcanal. What came home was a damaged soldier with trembling hands and dead eyes who discovered that alcohol could quiet the nightmares but awakened something violent in their place. He brought home techniques learned in interrogating prisoners, methods he applied to our family whenever his rage overwhelmed his self-control. Thomas was 5 years older than me, making him 22 that terrible summer. Tall and dark-haired like father, but with green eyes that held a coldness I'd noticed even as a child. While other boys collected baseball cards or built model airplanes, Thomas collected small animals, cats, rabbits, birds, that he would take to the barn for what he called experiments. I found their broken bodies buried behind the chicken coop, twisted into positions that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than natural death. My mother, Margaret Morrison, was a small woman with calloused hands and infinite patience, the kind of person who could birth a breech calf at dawn and still prepare Sunday dinner for the church social. She held our fracturing family together through sheer determination, absorbing Father's violence and Thomas's cruelty, while somehow maintaining the illusion that we were still a normal farming family. But I began noticing changes in her during spring 1952. She flinched when Thomas entered rooms, avoided being alone with him, developed a nervous habit of checking locks throughout the house. At 17, my world consisted of household chores, helping with farm work, and the constant fear that walked through our house like an unwelcome guest. I cooked, cleaned, tended the garden, and learned the art of invisibility, how to move through our home without drawing attention, how to disappear when Father's temper erupted, how to pretend I didn't see the bruises on Mother's arms or hear the sounds that came from her bedroom late at night. The warning signs accumulated like storm clouds on the horizon. Thomas had begun locking himself in his room for hours, emerging only for meals and farm duties. He watched Mother with predatory intensity, his gaze tracking her movements with the focused attention of a hunter studying prey. Most disturbing were his comments about Mother's appearance, how attractive she looked in certain dresses, how much younger she seemed when she smiled, how fortunate Father was to have such a beautiful wife. Father either ignored these remarks or was too lost in his own battles with alcohol and trauma to recognize their significance. He spent most evenings in the barn, drinking himself unconscious, while Thomas and I cleaned up after supper. These hours alone with my brother became increasingly uncomfortable as I sensed something predatory in his attention, something that made me want to barricade my bedroom door. But it was Mother who bore the brunt of Thomas's growing obsession. Through our thin walls, I heard their late-night conversations, whispered arguments that escalated into what sounded like threats. When I asked Mother about these discussions, she deflected with forced smiles and subject changes, but I could see terror accumulating in her eyes, like winter ice forming on our pond. The breaking point came on a sweltering July evening, when heat turned our house into an oven. Father had collapsed drunk in the barn, leaving Thomas' mother and me alone in the stifling kitchen. I was washing dishes when Thomas spoke to Mother in a voice I'd never heard, low, intimate, filled with barely contained menace. "You look beautiful tonight, Mother. That dress shows your figure perfectly." I turned to see Thomas standing directly behind Mother as she dried dishes close enough that his breath moved her hair. Mother had frozen, gripping the dish towel until her knuckles went white. "Thomas, please step back," she said quietly, her voice steady despite obvious terror. "Why, we're family. Nothing wrong with a son appreciating his mother's beauty." The way he emphasized appreciating made my stomach clench with revulsion. This wasn't normal familial affection. This was something sick and dangerous that had been poisoning our house like gas from a leak invisible but deadly. Mother moved away, but Thomas followed, maintaining that uncomfortable proximity, while I stood frozen at the sink. The kitchen felt charged with violence, as if the air itself held its breath. That night marked the beginning of the end, though I was too frightened to understand how quickly everything would spiral beyond salvation. In the suffocating heat of that July evening, watching my brother stalk our mother like wounded prey, I finally began to comprehend the true nature of the evil that had taken root in the Morrison family. The summer of 1952 brought heat that turned Kansas into a furnace, baking the earth until it cracked, and driving both livestock and humans to seek whatever shade existed. Our farmhouse, with its poor ventilation and sun-facing windows, became nearly unbearable during daylight hours, forcing us to conduct our lives in the marginally cooler evening hours, when sunset finally released its grip. It was during these stifling nights that I first heard the sounds emanating from Mother's bedroom. Sounds my 17-year-old mind couldn't immediately identify, but that filled me with creeping dread I couldn't name. Initially, I convinced myself it was the house settling or mice in the walls. But as the sounds became more frequent and distinct, I could no longer pretend ignorance. Thomas had begun visiting Mother's room after Father passed out each night. I heard his heavy footsteps in the hallway, Mother's door creaking open. Then other sounds of struggle, muffled protests, things happening that should never occur between mother and son. When I pressed my ear to the wall separating my room from hers, I heard Mother crying softly afterward, the broken weeping of someone whose spirit was being systematically destroyed. I should have acted. Should have confronted Thomas' awakened father, run to neighbors for help. But I was paralyzed by fear and disbelief, unable to accept that my suspicions reflected reality. The idea that my brother was capable of such evil seemed too monstrous, so I convinced myself I was misunderstanding that innocent explanations existed for the nocturnal visits and Mother's increasing despair. During daylight hours, Thomas behaved as if nothing unusual occurred. He performed farm duties with methodical efficiency, ate meals with normal appetite, made conversation about crops and weather, as if he hadn't spent previous nights committing unspeakable acts against our mother. This compartmentalization was perhaps the most frightening aspect. It suggested calculation and control beyond ordinary criminality. Mother, meanwhile, deteriorated visibly. Always small, she began appearing fragile in ways unrelated to physical size. Her hands shook while cooking. She startled at sudden noises. Dark circles developed under her eyes from sleepless nights spent in terror. Most tellingly, she avoided being alone with Thomas' timing activities, so Father or I would always be present when he was home. I finally grasped the full scope on a particularly scorching Tuesday evening in mid-July. Father had consumed more whiskey than usual and passed out earlier, leaving Thomas and me to finish chores. Working in the barn, feeding animals, and checking equipment, Thomas began discussing Mother in ways that made my skin crawl. "She's still beautiful for her age, don't you think, Eleanor?" he said while filling water troughs. "Most women get fat and ugly, but Mother kept her figure. Could still turn heads if she wanted. I kept my eyes on work, afraid to look directly at him. "She's our mother, Thomas. That's inappropriate." "Inappropriate." Thomas laughed without humor. "You sound like church ladies who think God cares about what happens between consenting adults. She's not consenting to anything. She's your mother." The words escaped before I could stop them. Thomas ceased working and turned with an expression mixing amusement and menace. "You've been listening at night, haven't you, Eleanor? Pressing your ear to the wall like a spy trying to understand what your big brother does with Mommy." His casual admission hit like a physical blow. He wasn't denying it, wasn't making excuses. He was confessing to rape as casually as admitting he'd taken extra pie at dinner. "Thomas, you have to stop. What you're doing is killing her." "What I'm doing is showing affection. Real affection, not father's indifference. She pretends to resist, but deep down, she enjoys the attention. Women always do once they stop fighting what they want." The twisted logic was almost as horrifying as the acts themselves. Thomas had convinced himself rape was love, that mother's terror and resistance were feminine games, making the experience more exciting. He'd created a fantasy where his violence was kindness, where his victim was secretly grateful. "She doesn't want your attention, Thomas. She's afraid of you. Can't you see her fear? She's afraid of admitting how much she likes it. But she's coming around. Last night, she barely fought. Soon, she won't fight at all, and we can be honest about what this really is." Horror washed over me as I realized Thomas was describing systematic spirit-breaking, gradual destruction of our mother's will to resist. He wasn't just raping her, he was trying to transform her into a willing participant in her own degradation. That night, lying in bed, listening to sounds from Mother's room, I accepted that I was the only person who could stop what was happening. Father was too drunk and damaged to protect anyone. Mother was too broken to protect herself. If I didn't act, Thomas would continue his attacks until he succeeded in destroying everything that made her who she was. I began planning his death that night, though I called it stopping him in my mind. The word murder felt too heavy, too final, too much like admitting I was capable of Thomas's evil. But whatever I called it, the mathematics were simple. Either Thomas died or Mother would die slowly and horribly at his hands. The question was how to kill him without getting caught, without becoming the kind of person who could kill easily. I wanted Thomas dead, but I didn't want to become him in the process. Over the following weeks, I studied Thomas's routines looking for vulnerabilities. He was strongest during daylight when farm work kept his body active and mind focused. But evenings after supper, he often spent time reading in the living room before beginning his nightly assault on Mother. During these periods, he was relaxed, distracted, confident in his household control. The kitchen knives were too obvious Thomas would see me reaching for them. Father's hunting rifles were locked in the gun cabinet, but there was a heavy cast iron skillet that hung beside the stove, substantial enough to cause serious damage, yet innocuous enough to carry without raising suspicion. My plan was simple. Wait for Thomas to become absorbed in reading, approach from behind, as if moving through the living room to reach stairs, then strike as hard as possible at the base of his skull. If I hit correctly, the blow would either kill immediately or render him unconscious long enough to finish with a kitchen knife. But before I could execute this plan, events accelerated beyond my control, in ways that would forever change my understanding of Thomas's evil and force me to confront truths more horrible than anything I'd imagined. The opportunity came sooner and more brutally than expected. On a Wednesday morning in late July, Mother collapsed while preparing breakfast, her legs giving out as she stood at the stove. When I helped her to a chair, I saw blood seeping through her dress, not bright red of fresh wounds, but dark, thick blood indicating internal damage and systematic trauma. "Eleanor," she whispered, voice so weak I had to lean close. "There's something hidden under my mattress. A journal. If anything happens to me, you must read it. Promise me." Her words filled me with dread, but I promised. That afternoon, while Thomas worked in distant fields, and Father lay unconscious in the barn, I found the journal Mother had hidden. Reading it destroyed any remaining illusions about my brother's character and revealed the true scope of evil that had infected our family. The journal began 6 months earlier, January 1952, with Mother's first concerns about Thomas's behavior. January 18th. Thomas has been acting strangely, staring at me in ways that make me uncomfortable. Today he made inappropriate comments about my body. I told Robert, but he just laughed and said Thomas was becoming a man. Robert doesn't understand what I'm worried about. Entries continued chronologically documenting Thomas's escalating harassment and Mother's growing fear. By March, he was making explicit sexual comments. By April, finding excuses for inappropriate touching. By May, the first assault occurred. May 8th. Thomas came to my room last night after Robert passed out. He forced himself on me while I begged him to stop. When finished, he said this was just beginning, that he'd wanted me for years, and now that he was strong enough to take what he wanted, nothing would stop him. I write this with shaking hands, barely able to hold the pen. I don't know what to do or who to tell. Who would believe such a thing? Attacks became regular after that first assault, occurring 2 or 3 times weekly, depending on Father's drinking schedule and Thomas's mood. Mother documented each with heartbreaking precision, recording not just physical violence, but psychological torture Thomas employed to break her resistance. May 25th. Thomas told me tonight that if I ever report what he's doing, he'll kill Eleanor and make it look accidental. He described in detail how he would do it, drowning her in the creek, claiming she slipped. I believe he means it. I see something inhuman in his eyes now, something that enjoys causing pain. I must protect Eleanor, even if it means sacrificing myself. June 10th. The attacks are worsening. Thomas is no longer content with simple rape. He wants to cause pain to see me suffer. He brings tools from the barn, sometimes things he uses to. I can't write about what he does with them. I can barely walk today. Eleanor asked if I was feeling well, and I had to lie. How do I tell my daughter her brother is a predator who sees women as objects to be broken? June 28th. Thomas has started talking about Eleanor during attacks. He says when he tires of me, he'll move to her. He describes what he plans to do in graphic detail, how he'll train her the same way he's training me. I must find a way to stop him before he touches my daughter. But I'm getting weaker, and he's growing stronger and more confident. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. The final entry was dated just days earlier, July 30th. I'm dying. I know I'm dying. The internal bleeding won't stop, and Thomas shows no signs of relenting. If anything, knowing he's killing me seems to excite him more. Last night, he said he wants to see how long I can last, how much damage a woman's body can absorb before it gives up. He's turned my death into a game-keeping score. Eleanor is in terrible danger. If I die before finding a way to protect her, she'll suffer the same fate. God help me, I'm too weak to fight anymore. But I must find strength to save my daughter. I closed the journal with violently shaking hands. Thomas wasn't just a rapist. He was a sadistic killer, slowly murdering our mother for entertainment. Worse, he planned to do the same to me once he finished with her. The attacks weren't passion or ordinary sexual violence. They were deliberate torture, designed to maximize suffering while prolonging death. That evening, helping Mother prepare supper, I could see the journal's truth written in her careful movements, shallow breathing, indicating internal injuries, gray pallor of someone whose body was shutting down. She was dying by degrees, and Thomas was savoring every moment of her destruction. I read your journal, I whispered as we worked together at the stove. Mother's hands stilled on the pot she was stirring. Then you know what you must do. I don't know how to kill him, Mother. You don't have to kill him, Eleanor. You just have to stop him. Whatever it takes, however you manage it, you must ensure he never hurts another woman the way he's hurt me. That night, listening to Mother's muffled screams through the wall, I made my decision. I couldn't save her. Thomas had inflicted too much damage for recovery. But I could prevent him from doing the same to me and whatever other women he might target. I spent the rest of the night planning exactly how I was going to kill my brother, no longer calling it anything but what it was: premeditated murder in defense of my life and the lives of his future victims. My first attempt nearly got me killed instead. 3 nights later, I tried using rat poison mixed into Thomas's evening coffee, reasoning it would appear like accidental food poisoning rather than murder. But I hadn't counted on Thomas's suspicious nature and growing paranoia about threats to his newfound household power. He took one sip and immediately spat it out, eyes fixing on me with deadly awareness. Interesting taste, Eleanor. Almost bitter with a chemical aftertaste. Would you like to try some? Before I could react, he grabbed my hair and forced my face toward the coffee cup, trying to make me drink what I'd prepared for him. I fought desperately, but Thomas was stronger and had surprise advantage. If Mother hadn't entered the kitchen at that moment, he would have succeeded in forcing the poison down my throat. Thomas, let her go, Mother said quietly, though her voice carried command that made him pause. Your daughter just tried to poison me, Mother. That deserves punishment, don't you think? Eleanor was trying to protect me. She doesn't understand that what happens between us is private family business. Do you, Eleanor? I stared at Mother, trying to understand what she wanted me to say. Her eyes held a message I couldn't decode, but I sensed my survival depended on playing along. No, Mother. I'm sorry, Thomas. I misunderstood what I heard at night. I thought you were hurting her. Thomas released my hair, but continued studying me with predatory calculation. And now? What do you think now? I think it's none of my business what consenting adults do in private. The lie tasted like acid, but it satisfied Thomas's ego. He smiled and nodded pleased. I'd acknowledged his version of reality, where Mother was a willing participant. That's right, little sister. Mother and I have an understanding that works for both of us. As long as you mind your business and don't interfere, there won't be problems. But if you try something like this again, he gestured toward the poisoned coffee. Accidents happen on farms all the time. Girls fall into grain silos, get trampled by cattle, drown in irrigation ditches. Very tragic, but these things happen when people aren't careful. The threat was clear, delivered with casual confidence of someone who had already planned exactly how he'd kill me if I became problematic. Thomas wasn't just dangerous. He was methodical, thinking steps ahead and preparing contingencies for every threat to his control. After he left, Mother grabbed my arm and pulled me close enough to whisper directly in my ear. He suspects you now. You can't try poison again. He'll watch everything you give him. You need a different approach. What kind of approach? Something direct. Something he won't see coming because he doesn't think you're brave enough to try it. Mother was right about Thomas's assessment. He saw me as a frightened child who might make one desperate attempt, but would ultimately submit once he demonstrated resistance consequences. That perception was both my greatest weakness and most valuable asset. If I could overcome fear long enough to act, I might catch him completely off guard. Over the following days, I studied Thomas's routines, looking for vulnerable moments. He was strongest and most alert during daylight, when farm work kept his body active and mind focused. But evenings after supper, he often spent an hour reading in the living room before beginning nightly assaults on Mother. During these quiet periods, he was relaxed and distracted, absorbed in books and confident in household control. The heavy iron poker beside the fireplace was too obvious Thomas would see me reaching for it. Kitchen knives were kept in a block on the counter, where movement toward them would be immediately visible. But there was a wooden rolling pin in the pantry, heavy enough to cause serious damage, yet innocuous enough to carry without raising suspicions. My revised plan was simple: wait for Thomas to become absorbed in reading, approach from behind, as if simply moving through the living room to reach stairs, then strike as hard as possible at the skull base. If I hit correctly, the blow would either kill immediately or render him unconscious long enough to finish with a kitchen knife. The opportunity came on a Friday evening when father had drunk himself into usual stupor, and mother was upstairs probably preparing mentally for another night of torture. Thomas sat in his favorite chair reading a farming magazine and occasionally making notes in margins. His back was to the living room entrance, and he seemed completely relaxed and unaware. I retrieved the rolling pin from the pantry and walked slowly toward the living room, heart hammering so hard I feared Thomas might hear it. Every step felt eternal, and I was certain he'd turn around any moment to discover my plan. But he remained absorbed in reading, occasionally turning pages or shifting position. When close enough to strike, I raised the rolling pin above my head and brought it down with every ounce of strength I could summon. But at the last second, some instinct warned Thomas of danger, and he threw himself sideways just as the blow landed. Instead of crushing his skull, the rolling pin struck his shoulder with enough force to knock him from his chair, but not incapacitate him. Thomas rolled away from my second swing and came to his feet with fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence. His shoulder was clearly injured. He held his left arm close to his body and winced when moving, but he was far from defenseless. "Well, well," he said, voice carrying equal measures of pain and amusement. "Little Eleanor has more fight than I expected. That actually hurt, sister. I'm impressed." I backed toward the kitchen, still gripping the rolling pin and looking for another opportunity to strike. But Thomas was no longer relaxed and distracted. He was fully alert and advancing with predatory focus. "You know what this means, don't you?" He continued, herding me away from potential exits and weapons. "You've declared war on me, Eleanor. And in war, there are winners and losers. Guess which one you're going to be?" What followed was the longest night of my life up to that point. Thomas didn't kill me immediately after my failed attack. Instead, he decided to use the situation as an opportunity to educate me about our family dynamic reality and my place within it. This education took the form of systematic psychological torture, designed to break my will to resist, while demonstrating exactly what would happen if I ever tried to oppose him again. First, he tied me to a kitchen chair using rope from the barn, binding my wrists and ankles so tightly the hemp cut into my skin when I struggled. Then he retrieved Mother from upstairs, dragging her down despite her obvious pain and weakness. In the bright electric light, I finally understood the full extent of damage Thomas had inflicted over recent months. She had lost at least 20 pounds, her face was gaunt and gray, and she moved like someone held together by willpower alone. "I want you to watch this, Eleanor," Thomas said as he forced Mother into a chair across from me. "I want you to understand exactly what happens to women in this family who don't show proper respect for natural order." What he did to Mother that night, while I was forced to witness every moment, went beyond rape into territory I lack vocabulary to describe even now, decades later. He used tools, instruments of torture, produced from a canvas bag. I'd never seen devices seemingly designed specifically to maximize pain while preventing unconsciousness. Throughout the ordeal, he provided running commentary about his techniques, explaining the anatomy of suffering as if conducting an educational seminar rather than committing murder. Mother never screamed. I think by that point, she was too damaged to produce loud sounds, or perhaps she was trying to spare me additional trauma of hearing her agony. But I could see life leaving her eyes with each new torture Thomas applied, could watch her spirit retreating deeper into herself as her body failed to protect her. "Pay attention, Eleanor," Thomas said when he noticed me trying to look away. "This is what happens to women who think they can defy men. This is natural consequence of rebellion. Mother has been learning this lesson for months, but she's been a slow student. You're going to be much faster." The implications were clear. When Thomas finished killing Mother, he was going to start the same process with me. The only difference was, I wouldn't have months to gradually accommodate increasing violence levels. He was going to accelerate my education, applying everything he'd learned from destroying Mother to systematic destruction of my own body and spirit. "Please," I whispered the first word I'd spoken since he'd tied me to the chair. "Please stop. Stop." Thomas paused in his work and looked at me with genuine curiosity. "Why would I stop? This is the most fun I've ever had. Look at what I can do, Eleanor. Look at the power I have over life and death. I can make her suffer for hours or end it in seconds, depending on my mood. I am God in this house." He returned attention to Mother, and I realized with crystalline clarity that reasoning or pleading would never work. He wasn't committing these acts from uncontrolled passion or ordinary criminal intent. He was doing them because he enjoyed them, because others' suffering had become his primary source of pleasure and satisfaction. He had moved beyond being dangerous into territory that was purely evil, and evil cannot be reasoned with. Mother died sometime around 3 a.m, though the exact moment was difficult to determine since Thomas had been careful to keep her conscious until final stages. When her breathing finally stopped, he sat back on his heels and surveyed his work with satisfaction of an artist completing a masterpiece. "Beautiful," he said softly. "Absolutely beautiful. See how peaceful she looks now, Eleanor. All that suffering, all that resistance, and now she's finally at rest. I gave her that peace. I am the one who ended her pain." He turned to face me, clothes soaked with blood and eyes bright with excitement. "Now it's your turn, little sister. But first, I think we should get some sleep. I want to be fresh when I start your education. I want to savor every moment of teaching you what Mother learned." Thomas untied me from the chair, but immediately bound my hands behind my back with shorter rope. He marched me upstairs to my bedroom and pushed me onto my bed, then secured my ankles to the bed frame so I couldn't run, even if I managed to free my hands. "Sweet dreams, Eleanor. Tomorrow we begin your real education about what it means to be a woman in this family." He left me alone with Mother's corpse in the kitchen below, and my own terror for company. I spent remaining hours until dawn working frantically to free myself from wrist rope, using the rough wooden bed frame to gradually fray hemp fibers. By sunrise, I'd managed to create enough slack to slip one hand free, and within minutes I'd untied my ankles as well. Thomas had made a crucial error in calculations. He'd assumed watching him murder Mother would break my spirit the way months of systematic torture had broken hers. Instead, witnessing her death crystallized my understanding of what Thomas was and what needed to be done. I was no longer a frightened girl trying to protect her mother. I was a young woman who had seen pure evil face to face and understood it could only be stopped by equal and opposite force. I crept downstairs and retrieved the sharpest knife from the kitchen, stepping carefully around Mother's body and trying not to look too closely at what Thomas had done to her. Then I returned to my room and waited for him to come collect me for the next phase of my education, the knife hidden beneath my pillow and my mind focused on a single clear objective. When Thomas woke and came for me, he was going to discover his student had learned a different lesson than he intended to teach. But before I could execute my plan, I made a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about Thomas and our family's history of violence. While searching his room for additional weapons or evidence that might help me understand his psychology, I found a hidden compartment behind his dresser, containing items that revealed the true scope of his evil. Inside were dozens of personal belongings clearly taken from victims, jewelry, hair ribbons, photographs, and other trophies collected over years of systematic murder. Among these horrific mementos was a leather journal in Thomas's handwriting, documenting crimes that stretched back to when he was barely 16 years old. The entries were clinical, methodical, describing the selection, stalking, capture, torture, and disposal of at least 15 young women from surrounding counties. But it was what I read about Thomas's motivation that truly shattered my understanding of our family dynamics. The journal revealed that Thomas's violence wasn't random psychopathy. It was learned behavior passed down from our father, who had been teaching him techniques of torture and murder since Thomas was a young teenager. March 15th, 1949. Father showed me the proper way to break a woman's spirit without killing her too quickly. The Chinese girl from town lasted 3 days using his methods. Father says pain is an art form, and I'm becoming quite the artist. June 3, 1950. Father is drinking more and becoming careless with disposal. I've been handling the recent acquisitions myself. He taught me well, but I'm surpassing the teacher. I understand the psychology of fear better than he ever did. September 12, 1951. Father mentioned that Eleanor is developing into a beautiful young woman. He said when she's ready, she'll join our family tradition the same way Mother did years ago. I look forward to being Eleanor's teacher when the time comes. The final entry was dated just weeks before Mother's death. June 20th, 1952. Father has become a liability. His drinking makes him unpredictable, and his obvious favoritism toward Eleanor is interfering with family business. Mother discovered too much and had to be dealt with, but Father's reaction suggested he was becoming sentimental about her. I may need to eliminate him soon and handle Eleanor's education myself. Some traditions must be preserved, even if it means removing those too weak to maintain them. I sat in Thomas's room holding his journal, my hands trembling, as I realized the full horror of what I'd been born into. This wasn't just about one evil brother. This was about generations of Morrison men who had been kidnapping, torturing, and murdering women for decades. Father hadn't become violent because of war trauma. The war had simply given him new techniques to apply to activities he'd been engaged in long before leaving for the Pacific. Mother hadn't been Thomas's first victim. She'd been his most recent in a long line of women who had suffered and died to satisfy Morrison family appetites. And I wasn't just Thomas's intended next victim. I was being groomed to continue a family tradition of evil that stretched back to my grandfather's generation. The journal contained detailed descriptions of torture methods, disposal techniques, and selection criteria for victims. Thomas had been taught not just to kill, but to make killing into an art form that maximized suffering while minimizing detection. He'd learned from Father, who had learned from his father before him, creating an unbroken chain of evil that had claimed dozens of lives over multiple generations. But perhaps most horrifying was Thomas's clinical analysis of my own psychology and his plans for incorporating me into family operations. Eleanor shows promising signs of intelligence and ruthlessness. Her failed poisoning attempt demonstrated initiative and planning capability. With proper training, she could become an effective partner rather than merely another victim. The key will be breaking her moral resistance while preserving her practical abilities. Father was too sentimental with Mother. I won't make that mistake with Eleanor. Thomas saw my attempt to poison him not as betrayal or threat, but as evidence that I possessed qualities he could develop and exploit. He wasn't planning to simply torture me to death. He was planning to transform me into someone like himself, someone capable of participating in the family business of murder. This revelation changed everything about my situation and my options. I wasn't just fighting for my life, I was fighting for my soul, for the right to remain human, rather than becoming another link in a chain of evil that stretched back generations. If I allowed Thomas to educate me, if I submitted to his training and conditioning, I would eventually become someone capable of torturing and killing innocent women for pleasure. The thought filled me with a rage so pure and focused that it burned away every trace of fear or uncertainty. Thomas had murdered my mother, planned to murder me, and intended to transform me into a killer like himself. He represented everything evil about our family history, everything that needed to be destroyed to prevent future victims from suffering. When Thomas appeared in my doorway that morning carrying coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone anticipating pleasure, he found me ready for him in ways he hadn't expected. I was no longer the frightened girl who had tried to poison him days earlier. I was someone who understood exactly what he represented and what needed to be done to stop him permanently. Thomas entered my room that morning with the casual confidence of a predator who believed his prey was already defeated. He set his coffee cup on my dresser and began removing his shirt, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who wanted to savor anticipation of violence to come. Good morning, Eleanor, he said cheerfully. I trust you slept well. I know I did. There's something about completing a difficult project that helps me rest better. I kept my hands beneath the blanket where the knife was hidden and tried to maintain neutral expression despite rage burning in my chest. I slept fine, Thomas. Excellent. I was concerned that watching Mother's education might have been traumatic, but you seem to be adjusting well to our new family dynamic. He sipped his coffee and studied me with clinical interest. Are you ready to begin your own lessons? What kind of lessons? The same kind Mother received, of course. The kind that teach a woman her proper place in natural order. You'll find the process quite educational, though I should warn you, it can be somewhat intense at first. Thomas stepped closer and closed the door behind him, beginning to unbuckle his belt with casual efficiency. But I was ready for him in ways he couldn't anticipate. Thomas, I said quietly, sitting up but keeping the knife concealed. Yes, little sister. Before you start my education, I want you to know something. He paused, apparently amused by my desire to talk. Of course. What would you like to tell me? I found your journal. I read about what you and Father have been doing. I know about the other women, about the family tradition, about your plans for me. Thomas's expression shifted from amusement to sharp attention. Did you now? And what do you think about what you learned? I think you're going to die today. I pulled the knife from beneath my blanket and lunged forward with both hands, aiming for the center of his chest. But Thomas's reflexes were faster than I'd anticipated, and he threw himself backward just as the blade reached him. Instead of penetrating his heart, the knife sliced across his ribs, opening a long, shallow cut that bled freely but wasn't immediately fatal. You little bitch! He snarled, pressing one hand to his wounded side while reaching for me with the other. You actually cut me! I rolled away from his grasping hands and came to my feet on the opposite side of the bed, still gripping the bloody knife. The cut I'd inflicted was painful but not incapacitating. Thomas was wounded but still extremely dangerous. But as we faced each other across my small bedroom, Thomas began to smile with genuine appreciation rather than anger. You know what, Eleanor? I'm actually proud of you. That was well planned and properly executed. You've got natural talent for this kind of work. His reaction confused and unsettled me. I'd expected rage or pain, not professional admiration for my attack. You're not angry. Angry. Why would I be angry? You just demonstrated exactly the kind of ruthless intelligence our family needs. Father always said you had potential. Now I can see he was right. Thomas began circling around the bed toward me, moving carefully because of his injury, but showing no signs of retreat or surrender. Here's what's going to happen, Eleanor. You're going to put down that knife and let me finish what I started. But instead of the long, painful education I had planned for you, I'm going to make you an offer. Join our family business willingly, and I'll teach you everything Father taught me. Refuse, and you'll learn the same lessons Mother learned, just much faster. I'll never become like you. Oh, but you already are like me, Eleanor. You just proved it by cutting me. You have killer instincts, you just need proper training to develop them. As Thomas continued his slow advance around my bed, he began talking about something that would change everything. I thought I understood about our family and my place within it. You want to know why Father always treated you differently than he treated Mother and me? Why he was gentler with you, more protective, more patient with your mistakes? Despite my terror, I found myself curious about this question that had puzzled me throughout childhood. Because you remind him of his sister, my Aunt Catherine. She was Father's favorite person in the world when they were children, and she looked exactly like you do now. Same blonde hair, same blue eyes, same delicate features. Thomas paused his advance, savoring the moment before delivering information he knew would devastate me. Catherine was also Father's first victim, Eleanor. When he was 16 and she was 14, he practiced on her everything his own father had taught him about breaking women. He kept her alive for weeks, learning techniques he would later use on dozens of other victims. And when he finally killed her, he cried for days because he'd destroyed the only person he ever truly loved. The revelation hit me like physical blow. Father's strange, protective behavior toward me throughout my childhood hadn't been paternal love. It had been guilt and nostalgia for his dead sister, whose appearance I shared. That's why he could never bring himself to let me start your education earlier, Thomas continued. Every time he looked at you, he saw Catherine and remembered what he'd done to her. His sentiment made him weak, Eleanor, but it also saved your life for 17 years. Thomas was close enough now that I could smell the metallic scent of blood from his wound. But Father's dead, now killed by his own weakness and alcoholism. And I don't share his sentimental attachment to family members who happen to resemble previous victims. You're going to learn what Catherine learned, what Mother learned, what dozens of other women learned at Morrison Hands. The knife felt impossibly heavy in my grip as I realized the full scope of evil I was fighting against. This wasn't just about Thomas, it was about breaking a cycle of violence that had consumed generations of my family, turning fathers into teachers of torture, and sons into eager students of murder. But first, Thomas said, now close enough to grab for the knife, you're going to understand that everything you think you know about right and wrong is just weakness. Family loyalty is the only morality that matters, Eleanor. Blood protects blood, even when blood has to spill blood. He lunged for the weapon, and our final struggle began. The fight for my life took place in the suffocating heat of my childhood bedroom, where sunlight streaming through windows illuminated the blood spreading across wooden floorboards as Thomas and I grappled for control of the knife. He was stronger, but his wound had weakened him, and desperation gave me strength I'd never possessed before. We crashed into my dresser, sending the mirror and various personal items flying. Thomas managed to get his hands around my throat, cutting off my air, while I clawed at his face with my free hand and tried to bring the knife into position to strike at him again. "You stupid girl!" He gasped, blood from his chest wound soaking through his shirt. "You could have had everything. Power, freedom, the ability to make others suffer the way you've suffered. Instead, you choose to die defending people who would never defend you." I couldn't speak with his hands crushing my windpipe, but I managed to drive my knee upward into his wounded ribs. Thomas yelped and loosened his grip just enough for me to break free and stumble toward the bedroom door. But Thomas recovered quickly and tackled me before I could reach the hallway, sending both of us crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The knife skittered away across the floorboards, coming to rest beneath my bed, where neither of us could easily reach it. "Now, you've made me angry," Thomas said, straddling my chest and pinning my arms with his knees. "I was going to make this educational for you, Eleanor. I was going to teach you about family tradition and help you understand your place in our history. But you've decided to be difficult." His hands closed around my throat again, but this time his grip was methodical rather than desperate. He was applying pressure, gradually cutting off my air supply slowly enough to maximize my suffering, while ensuring I remained conscious as long as possible. "This is how Catherine died," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "Father told me all about it, how she struggled at first, then grew weaker, then finally accepted what was happening to her. By the end, she was grateful when he ended her pain. Black spots began appearing at the edges of my vision as oxygen deprivation took effect. But with consciousness fading, I heard Thomas say something that changed everything about how I understood his psychology and motivations. "Father chose you over me, Eleanor. His precious little Catherine replacement got protection and gentleness while I got training and expectations. Do you know what it's like to be the son who has to earn approval by becoming a killer, while the daughter gets love simply for existing?" Through my dying gasps, I realized that Thomas's violence wasn't just learned behavior or family tradition. It was driven by jealousy and resentment over Father's differential treatment of his children. Thomas had been forced to become evil to gain Father's attention, while I had received affection simply for resembling a long-dead aunt. This understanding gave me crucial insight into Thomas's psychology, and more importantly, a weapon I could use against him even as he strangled me to death. "You're jealous?" I managed to whisper through his choking grip. Thomas's hands tightened reflexively. What did you say? Jealous of a little girl who never knew why father protected her. Shut up. You killed innocent women because you couldn't handle being second choice. Thomas's face contorted with rage, but his grip loosened slightly as my words hit their target. I said, shut up. You're not a killer because of family tradition. You're a killer because you're weak. And father knew it. The psychological attack worked better than physical resistance had. Thomas released my throat and drew back his fist to strike me, providing the opening I needed to reach for a heavy glass lamp that had fallen from my nightstand during our struggle. I smashed the lamp across Thomas's temple with every ounce of strength I could summon. He toppled sideways, stunned, but not unconscious, giving me time to crawl toward the bed and retrieve the knife from where it had fallen. When Thomas shook his head clear and focused on me again, I was standing over him with the blade positioned directly above his heart. Eleanor. He said, his voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. You don't understand what you're doing. If you kill me, you'll be alone with Father's legacy. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you're capable of the same evil that consumed our family. Maybe, I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. But I'd rather spend my life wondering than spend it becoming you. Think about this rationally. I'm the only family you have left. If you kill me, you'll have no one who understands what you've been through. No one who knows the truth about our history. Thomas was trying to manipulate me using loneliness and shared trauma, appealing to the part of me that craved connection and understanding. But I had learned too much about his true nature to be swayed by false promises of kinship. I understand our history perfectly, Thomas. I understand that it needs to end with you. I raised the knife higher, preparing to drive it down into his chest. But Thomas made one final desperate attempt to save himself by revealing information he thought might change my mind. Wait, he gasped. There's something else you need to know. About Mother, about why she really had to die. Despite myself, I hesitated. What about Mother? She wasn't just a victim, Eleanor. She was a willing participant for years before she tried to betray us. She helped Father select targets, helped lure women to isolated locations where they could be taken safely. Mother was part of our family business long before I was old enough to participate. The revelation hit me like ice water, threatening to shatter everything I believed about the woman I'd died trying to protect. You're lying. I'm not lying. Check Father's papers in the basement if you don't believe me. Mother has been helping with acquisitions since before you were born. She only turned against us when she realized you were getting old enough to become involved. Thomas saw doubt creeping into my expression and pressed his advantage. She didn't try to protect you out of maternal love, Eleanor. She tried to protect you because she knew that bringing you into family operations would mean sharing Father's attention, and she couldn't handle competition from her own daughter. Whether or not Thomas was telling the truth, I realized it didn't matter. Even if Mother had been complicit in previous murders, even if her protection of me had been motivated by selfishness rather than love, it didn't change what Thomas represented or what needed to be done about him. Even if that's true, I said, it doesn't change anything. You're still a killer who needs to be stopped. Oh, but don't you see? If Mother was part of it, if she chose to participate in family tradition, then maybe it's not evil. Maybe it's just what Morrison family members do to survive in a world that would destroy us if it knew what we really are. Thomas was offering me a rationalization that would allow me to see our family's crimes as justifiable rather than monstrous. He was trying to seduce me into accepting evil as natural murder, as family tradition, rather than moral abomination. The attempt failed completely. No, Thomas. What our family did was evil. What you did to Mother was evil. What you planned to do to me was evil. And you're evil for thinking there's any justification for torture and murder. I drove the knife down with both hands, putting all my weight behind the blade as it penetrated Thomas's chest just below his sternum. His eyes widened with surprise and pain as steel found his heart ending his ability to speak or move. But even as he died, Thomas made one final attempt to destroy me. His hands shot up and grabbed my wrists, pulling me forward with the last of his strength. His intention was to make me fall on top of him to die together in a final embrace that would deny me the victory of survival. For a moment, it seemed like he might succeed. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone with a knife through his heart, and I felt myself being pulled inexorably toward him. But at the last second, I managed to brace my feet against the floor and pull back, breaking free just as Thomas's strength finally failed him. He fell back to the bedroom floor, the knife still protruding from his chest, and exhaled his last breath with my name on his lips. I stood over my brother's corpse, covered in his blood, shaking with exhaustion and shock, finally understanding that the evil that had consumed our family was truly dead. The cycle of violence that had claimed generations of Morrison victims had been broken by someone who refused to become its next link. Thomas was dead. Father was dead. The family tradition of torture and murder died with them. And I was alive, free and human in ways I had never thought possible. The aftermath of Thomas's death brought a strange sense of calm that I now recognize as shock mixed with profound relief. My mind seemed to disconnect from my body, allowing me to function with mechanical efficiency while processing what had occurred. I cleaned his blood from my hands, changed into fresh clothes, and began the practical work of disposing of evidence before anyone could discover what had happened in our house. Father's body lay where I had left it in the barn, killed by his own alcoholism and liver disease 3 days after Thomas murdered Mother. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who had taught my brother to torture and kill had died alone and unconscious, too drunk to defend himself when his damaged organs finally surrendered. I had found his corpse that morning and decided to leave it undisturbed until I finished with Thomas. Now, I had 3 bodies to dispose of Mother Thomas and Father. The task seemed overwhelming for someone of my size and experience, but Thomas's journal had contained detailed instructions for body disposal that I could follow. The same methodical approach he had used to document his crimes would help me conceal mine. I spent the morning digging graves in the remote northwest corner of our property, near a stand of cottonwood trees, where the soil was soft and the location invisible from our house or neighboring farms. The work was exhausting, but adrenaline and determination kept me moving, even when my muscles screamed for rest. Moving the bodies required multiple trips and considerable ingenuity. Mother had been small in life and was manageable in death, though the weight of dead flesh is always greater than appearances suggest. Father was heavier, but had been dead long enough that rigor mortis made him easier to transport. Thomas presented the greatest challenge, not just because of his size, but because I had to work around the knife still embedded in his chest. By evening, all 3 bodies were buried beneath 6 feet of Kansas earth, covered with lime from Father's farming supplies, to discourage scavengers and accelerate decomposition. I burned their blood-stained clothing, and bedding scrubbed every surface in the house with bleach and lye soap, and disposed of weapons and tools used in their deaths. The official story I prepared was simple. My family had decided to move to California for better farming opportunities, and I was staying behind temporarily to sell the property and settle their affairs. Given our family's reputation for keeping to ourselves and the general chaos of post-war population movement, no one in Willow Creek was likely to ask detailed questions about the Morrison family's sudden departure. Sheriff Harlan made one perfunctory visit 2 weeks later, responding to a neighbor's concern about not seeing smoke from our chimney. I showed him a forged letter, supposedly from Father, explaining the family's relocation, and authorizing me to handle property matters. Harlan accepted the explanation without investigation, probably relieved to have one less problem family in his jurisdiction. Over the following months, I liquidated our livestock and farm equipment, depositing proceeds in a bank account I had opened under an assumed name. I also made arrangements to assume a new identity, Eleanor Hayes, an orphan from Oklahoma who had come to Kansas looking for work. The transformation allowed me to start fresh while maintaining enough connection to my original identity to monitor any potential complications from my family's disappearance. The most difficult aspect of this period was psychological rather than practical. Living alone in the house where so much violence had occurred, surrounded by reminders of everything I had lost and everything I had done to survive, I began experiencing symptoms I now understand were severe trauma responses. Nightmares that left me screaming, panic attacks triggered by unexpected sounds, periods of dissociation where I lost hours to memories of blood and death. But beneath the trauma was something else, a profound sense of peace that came from knowing I had broken the cycle of violence that had consumed generations of Morrison family members. Thomas would never rape and torture another woman. Father would never teach another son to become a killer. The evil that had infected our bloodline was permanently ended. In September 1952, I staged my own disappearance from the Morrison farm, leaving evidence suggesting I had been kidnapped by unknown criminals who had probably killed me. Sheriff Harlan conducted a brief investigation that concluded I had likely been murdered by the same people responsible for my family's sudden departure to California. As Eleanor Hayes, I moved to Denver and found work as a seamstress, living quietly and building a new life that bore no resemblance to the violence I had left behind. I never married, never had children, never built the kind of conventional family most people take for granted. But I volunteered at shelters for abused women, using my understanding of domestic violence to help others escape dangerous situations before they reached the desperate circumstances I had faced. Some of these women credited our conversations with saving their lives. That knowledge helped ease the guilt I carried about the lives I had taken, transforming my capacity for violence into a force for protection and healing. 33 years have passed since the summer of 1952. I am 50 now, living with the certainty that cancer will claim me within months. But I face approaching death with something approaching tranquility, because I know I used my life well after surviving hell. I never regretted killing Thomas, or allowing Father to die alone, or concealing their crimes along with my own. Evil must be stopped, and sometimes the only people positioned to stop it are those who have been damaged by it but refused to be destroyed. The world is safer because Thomas Morrison is dead. Other women lived because I was willing to become a killer when killing was the only solution available. I broke the cycle of violence that had consumed my family for generations, ensuring it would die with me rather than continuing to claim future victims. Today, December 15th, 1985. I finish writing this account and place it in the strongbox with my other important papers to be opened only after my death. I feel peaceful knowing that someone might someday read this and understand that survival sometimes requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things, that love can become twisted into evil, and that the greatest act of courage is often the willingness to end something rather than allow it to continue. I have carried this burden for 33 years, but I no longer feel burdened by it. I feel proud of the frightened 17-year-old girl who found the strength to kill her brother rather than become his victim. I feel grateful for the opportunity to transform my experience with violence into protection for other women. Most of all, I feel satisfied knowing that the Morrison family tradition of torture and murder died with Thomas buried forever in unmarked graves beneath Kansas soil. The evil that consumed my family is truly dead, and I am finally free.